Greetings. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you for joining us. Feel free to use the chat feature to tell us where you're joining from. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is eligible for 1.5 contact hours. Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. The Nurse Planning Committee members and the content experts have disclosed no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies. To receive contact hours for this NCPD session, participants are required to attend the webinar and log into our learning management system to complete an evaluation form. Information on how to access this will be emailed to attendees approximately 1 week after the webinar. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available via the Sigma repository within a few business days of recording. Following the presentation, if we have time, we'll have a question and answer session. You'll see on your Zoom webinar control panel that you can send a question through the Q&A feature. This is where you can type in any question you'd like to pose to the presenters. Be sure to hit send so the message makes it to us. Please use the Q&A for questions and the chat feature to interact with other participants. We'd like to thank our speakers for sharing their expertise with us today. Of note, thoughts and views expressed of the presenters do not necessarily reflect that of Sigma. Our speakers today are Andrew Penn and Melanie Kaushima Velez. Andrew Penn is a psychiatric nurse practitioner, clinical professor at UCSF, and a researcher in psychedelic therapies in nursing. He has published widely on psychedelic therapies and their intersections with nursing and is the co-founder of opennurses.org. And he is an internationally invited speaker and teaches on psychopharmacology and psychedelic therapies and can be found at andrewpennp.com. Melanie is a ketamine-assisted therapist, prescriber, and a community psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner treating lifespan psychiatry and addictions. Her postdoctoral training focused on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and research at the California Institute of Integral Studies CPTR program. Melanie is an instructor at Subtle Winds Psilocybin, a facilitator training program. For the past 2 decades, she has offered volunteer psychedelic peer support in Oregon. We are so grateful to have both of you here today, and we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you for that, Linda. Good morning, everyone. And it's really early morning here in California on the West Coast where Melanie and I are. It's 7 a.m., so I feel like I'm starting a day shift in the hospital. Whenever I worked in the hospital, I always liked swing shift because all the administrators had gone home and it was a little quieter. So day shift is a little clunky for me, but it's really exciting to be here. And just looking at the chat, seeing all the people coming in from really all over the world, which is super exciting for this topic. So thanks for being here. And those of you who are watching on recording, appreciate your interest. So as mentioned, my name is Andrew Penn. I am a psychiatric nurse practitioner by training, and I teach psychiatric nurse practitioners at UCSF. And in that role, I also get to do clinical work at the San Francisco Veterans Administration Hospital and get to have some time set aside to do research. And I've worked on phase 3 and phase 2 studies, clinical studies of psychedelics in psychiatric conditions. And so that's where some of my funding comes from for my position. So there's my contact information. You're welcome to reach out to me after this presentation, and my website is there as well. And I believe Melanie's disclosures are. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of difficulty controlling the slides remotely. Here we go. Good, it's working now. There's Melanie's information, and her bio is linked there. So what we're going to try and do here is really kind of give you a bit of an orientation. You know, if you've been paying any attention to the popular media, you've undoubtedly seen things about psychedelics, and there's certainly a lot in the environment right now talking about this, not only within mental health but also areas such as palliative care and addiction medicine. So we want to try and give you a little bit of an orientation to that. And really, because this is a nursing organization, really want to spend a lot of our time focusing more on the role of nursing and how that's going to be a critical component of this. And also, as many of you know, these are compounds which historically have been controlled substances and remain so in most places. And so trying to kind of understand that intersection between this work and how that interfaces with the legal aspects of this. Obviously not giving any legal advice here. And really to think about how we can help patients that are already doing this, because while we are certainly doing research on this, 99% of people who have ever had a psychedelic experience probably did not have that inside of a research study. And so your patients are already doing this, your peers may already be doing this, and we want you to leave this talk being a little more informed about this content. So as mentioned, these are certainly not recommendations, and I'm happy to give sort of broad level information. But as I've heard it pointed out, Melanie are both nurse practitioners, but we are not your nurse practitioner. So we can't give you specific advice on specific patients or yourself. So let's get a little oriented here. You know, when we think about how do we treat mental health conditions, and that's my bias because I'm a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, and we generally think of taking sort of one of two approaches. We might do psychotherapy, and the patient might experience some improvement, or we might provide psychopharmacology, which also might provide some improvement. But the essential model that we're talking about here is really, what if we combined the two things? And you might be thinking, well, we do that already. You know, we recommend to people all the time that if they're taking, say, an antidepressant, that they might additionally benefit from psychotherapy. But really the idea here is that we use a medication, a drug, if you will, to catalyze a psychotherapy process. So in these models, we're not talking about taking something like psilocybin every day. We're talking about using it 1, 2, maybe 3 times in a very specific context, in a very specific container of relational psychotherapy, in order to really kind of accelerate these therapeutic outcomes. That's the basic frame that we're talking about today. And, you know, one thing that's interesting is, despite what you might be reading in newspapers, this is actually not a new idea. So psychedelics have been part of human history for as far back as 6,000 years. So there's a long history of this, which we don't really have time to get into, but it's important to understand that this is not new technology. This is that indigenous cultures have known about this for millennia and have used this in what we would consider healing context for a long, long time. But in many ways, the what we might consider the modern history of the psychedelic era began in 1943, arguably 1938, when that gentleman in the very top left corner, Dr. Albert Hofmann, discovered somewhat accidentally LSD. He was working for Sandoz at the time, which is a large pharmaceutical company in Switzerland, and they were working with a series of drugs called ergotamines. And if any midwives are in the audience, you certainly know about ergot, because ergot was used in midwifery practice for centuries. to help with things like postpartum bleeding. And so they were working along that line of inquiry, having no idea that this particular variation of this lysergic acid diethylamide was psychoactive until he, as the story goes, accidentally probably got some on his fingertips, probably touched his mouth, as we often do. Remember during the early days of COVID, we were all told not to touch our faces, and you realize how often you touch your face. Nevertheless, he inadvertently ingested some and actually thought he'd poisoned himself, and was quite scared. Got himself home with the help of his young lab assistant, a woman named Susie Ramstein, who was arguably the first person to sit with somebody having a psychedelic experience. Got him home on a bicycle because it was wartime, 1943. Gasoline was rationed, so they had bicycles. They got home on bicycles. And he had thought he'd poisoned himself. So he called his physician, who examined him and saw nothing out of the ordinary except very dilated pupils. But he had this very intense experience that we would now call a psychedelic experience. And that led to this really interesting area of inquiry, because you have to remember this is before sort of clinical trials were as they were now. And Sandoz sort of had a solution looking for a problem. And what they did was they sort of engaged in what you might call very early crowdsourcing, which is that they said, they put a call out and they said, we have an interesting compound, which we will send to any responsible psychiatrist who sends us a letter and asks for some, and on the condition that you please let us know what you did with it. And a number of psychiatrists around the world took them up on that, including people such as Stan Grof, who's the person on the right there. And this is also a drug that has an interesting cultural history, as you know, too. So that's Aldous Huxley on the left, who wrote a book in 1953 called The Doors of Perception, which was actually the book that got me interested in this work when I was in high school. I had read somewhere that the rock band The Doors had gotten their name from this book, The Doors of Perception, and that lit a little interest in me, and I started reading about that. And so, Aldous Huxley talked about psychedelics in the 1950s. And then, of course, where most people sort of pick up the thread is in the mid 1960s, where Timothy Leary, who up until about 1963, I believe, had been a professor at Harvard, professor of psychology, began sort of proselytizing the use of LSD, particularly among young people. And that, famously led to a lot of challenges, and the initiation of the Controlled Substance Act in the United States in 1970, which was signed by Richard Nixon, which really was sort of the final nail in the coffin that had begun some years before, not only with LSD, but just generally with the lack of regulation in drug safety. Thalidomide, which was being given widely to pregnant women and then was found to result in serious birth defects, was another reason why there was this greater scrutiny and regulation of prescription drugs. And so the Controlled Substance Act essentially ended this research and made it very difficult to do any kind of meaningful study, because these drugs were defined as having no medical use and significant potential for misuse. And that's how most of us got trained around this whole class of drugs. I mean, if you had any training in psychedelic drugs in your nursing training, it probably was half a page in a book on addiction medicine, and they were lumped in with things such as heroin and cocaine, which interestingly, cocaine is actually a Schedule II drug in the United States, because it's used in ear, nose, and throat surgery. But nevertheless, these were all kind of lumped together as a sort of a unified group, which they're anything but, which made doing research very difficult on them until around sort of the mid 1990s, when a group of I would call them very courageous researchers, one of whom just passed in the last week, Roland Griffiths, the white-haired gentleman at the 9 o'clock position there, who was at Johns Hopkins, and really began this area of really what you might call a renaissance in serious inquiry around the use of psychedelics in controlled situations for the treatment of certain medical conditions. And so, interestingly, that's now been going on for close to 30 years. The very first study was done in 1994 by the gentleman below Roland there, Rick Strassman, but that was almost 30 years ago. And so the pre-prohibition period lasted for about 27 years, and we're now approaching about 30 years of this sort of Renaissance period. So very interesting. And then the papers that came out of this kind of reflect the rigor of research at the time. So most of these studies that were done up until around 1990 were largely case studies of sort of low methodological quality, and often focusing mostly on harms. And the more recent studies, which you can see are growing at an almost exponential rate. There was a time when I used to be able to cite just about any existing psychedelic study, and those days are far behind me. I'm struggling to keep up with the research. There's so much coming out these days. And because this is a nursing presentation, I really want to highlight the role of nursing on this, and the historic role of nursing and the current role of nursing, which Melanie and I are both going to talk about. So when I started looking at this with some more serious scholarship around 5 years ago, I did a deep dive into the literature, and I wanted to see what had nurses published in those pre-prohibition years. And I stumbled across a gold mine in the form of a 1964. 1964. So 60 years ago, there was an article in the American Journal of Nursing. Yes, that American Journal of Nursing, our flagship journal, by a woman a nurse in Canada, in Saskatchewan, Canada, named Kay Parley. And the article, as you can see there, was called Supporting the Patient on LSD Day, believe it or not. And this article was written from her perspective of working with a physician by the name of Humphrey Osmond, who was a British psychiatrist who'd come to Canada and was treating patients with what we would now call alcohol use disorder with LSD at a large state hospital in Regina, Canada. And you have to remember, 1964 is sort of before the Timothy Leary, Summer of Love period. So this was a very sober, very clear-eyed article. Nothing really mystical or what we would call in California woo-woo about it, but really just really talking about this relationship between the nurse and the patient during these LSD sessions, because they would treat people with LSD periodically, sit with them, and do psychotherapy either during or after. And she talks about this sort of sensitivity that patients on LSD had to their environment, including the people that were in that environment, and the need for attentive, caring presence, which I think is really sort of native intelligence for nurses. And she has this beautiful quote. She said, "The nurse-patient relationship during LSD treatment is, I suspect, like that between partners on a mountain climbing team. Warm, cooperative, intimate, and yet objective." And I thought, surely she must have passed on, because this was maybe 5 years ago. And so I did a little digging around. Turns out, not only is she still alive, and she just turned 100 this March, she is still sharp of mind. And in 2016, she wrote a memoir, which I can't recommend highly enough, called Inside the Mental. And it talks about her experience of, before she was a nurse, get a load of this, she was actually a patient in that same hospital. She is quite open about having what we now call bipolar disorder. She calls it manic depression, but same illness, which her father had. And she had her first episode of mania when she was about 18 or 19, and ended up as a patient in this hospital for some years before getting well, getting out of the hospital, and going to nursing school. And the job she took when she got out of nursing school, she went back to where she had been treated and worked in this environment for many years, and then wrote this memoir about it. It's a beautiful read. I highly recommend it. So the point of this Shaggy Dog story is to tell you that nurses have been doing this work for a long, long time, and that nurses will be central to this work going forward in the future. And I was so taken by this, and as I was looking through the current literature, I realized that the nursing literature was actually fairly devoid of any content around psychedelic therapy in the modern era. So along with three of my writing partners, we approached AJN and we said, we'd like to write the follow-up to that story. 57 years later, and they said yes to the article. So we published this in 2021, and AJN was was thoughtful enough to actually reprint Kay Parley's original article as a sidebar to our review article that was published in 2021. So I thought that was a really nice way that we could honor our pioneer, Kay Parley, in that article. So this is openly available, and it's also on my website. So in case you're just tuning in and you're wondering, what are we actually talking about here? He keeps saying psychedelic, but what does that actually mean? I want to give some sort of operational definitions here. So we have two things which could be absolutely considered psychedelic agents, although they're not always talked about as such, that are used in psychiatry and sometimes in palliative care. And that's ketamine, which has been around since 1970, FDA approved surgical anesthetic, and S-ketamine, which was approved about 5 years ago. It's the left enantiomer of the racemic ketamine molecule and is a rapidly acting antidepressant that's delivered in the form of a nasal spray. But both of these have some of the same kind of subjective effects that we see with other psychedelics, in that they often will engender a rich inner directed experience that can also come with some perceptual changes and such. But really the sort of hallucinatory aspect, and that's the term many of us got trained with, was these were hallucinogens, which is really a misnomer because many of them actually do not cause true hallucinations. They may cause some distortion of perception, but generally not true hallucinations. But nevertheless, nomenclature notwithstanding, those two are currently available in most places. I realize this is an international audience, so they may not be available where you live. And then on the three on the right are generally not available in most places. There are some exceptions, but we're talking about methylene dioxymethamphetamine, or MDMA, psilocybin, which is the psychoactive ingredient in sometimes called magic mushrooms or psilocybe genus of mushrooms, and lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. So very different drugs, but all sort of get lumped under this heading of psychedelics. And you might be wondering, for what conditions, and that's an important consideration here. So what's interesting about this is it's when we look at the studies that are currently underway, it's quite a wide range of possible indications. So there's things such as depression, which you've probably heard about, but also things such as substance use disorders. There are things such as OCD and eating disorders, PTSD, and interestingly, chronic pain. Now, all of these conditions are, one could say, that Andrew, that looks like quite a wide range of very different kinds of conditions, but these could all be seen as having the similarity that they are what we might call in physics, they have a state of low entropy. Entropy is the prediction of change in a state. And if we ask somebody who has one of these conditions, do you think you'll be different next week? They'll say, well, no, I've been this way for 10 years. Why would I be different next week? So we can say these are all conditions that are characterized by low entropy, difficulty to disrupt, low probability of change. And it may be that what psychedelics do is engender a period of high entropy for a few hours, which can then be leveraged in a therapeutic context to make some important changes in here. But I want to also point out a couple of other things that may, if perhaps you've been fortunate enough to get through your life without having had to deal with any of these conditions. We know sadly that 20-25% of people will deal with depression at some point in their lives. But even if you manage to skirt all of these things in your entire life, there's one thing that I can predict, and that's that you will die. And that this is another area of very interesting inquiry in the psychedelic space is, could psychedelics be useful in palliative care to help people essentially come to peace, to reconcile with things that are unresolved for them as they approach the end of their lives. And then finally, this question, which Melanie, I think, is going to speak more to, which is really the idea that our colleague Bob Jesse has articulated so concisely in a phrase of the betterment of well people. So do you have to have a medical condition? Do you have to be dying in order to benefit from some of the things that psychedelics may provide? And this is this larger question, which I think Oregon is making an attempt at addressing, of can these be used safely for people that don't have a clinical condition to really improve their, say, wellness or state of mind? So let's talk about how this is delivered, because you might be sitting here thinking like, wow, this is really weird. Am I going to send a patient to the drugstore to go pick up psilocybin mushrooms? That seems really kind of out there, Andrew. So let's talk about the framework in which this happens. So first of all, in our studies, we have a period of what we call preparation therapy. No drugs are involved in this. So during this, anywhere between sort of 4 to 8 hours is fairly typical in most studies. It's usually 2 or 3 sessions where the subject, because it's a research subject study, will meet with the therapist or 2 therapists, is often the case, for several hours. And that period of time is really intended for this relationship to begin to develop. So, you could think of this, if you're a staff nurse, this is your change of shift period of time. You've gotten a report, you're going in and you're starting to get to know this patient. They're starting to get to know you. And why do we do that? Well, first of all, we're assessing the situation. Nurses are always assessing, as our friends and family seem to be well aware of. But we're also, in that assessment, we're establishing a kind of trust and safety. And we're also educating the patient about what's to happen next, what to expect. And in this particular setting, we're really trying to create some set of intentions while holding lightly any kind of expectations about what's going to happen next. And we're creating what we call the set, which is the mindset, and the setting, which is all the things that are going to be holding this person while they are in this psychedelic session. So the physical room, the relationship with the subjects, an understanding of how difficult situations would be managed, that is all being created during the preparation period. And then on the day of dosing, person comes in early in the morning. I usually get to the lab at 7:30 in the morning. The subject gets there about 8:15. And usually by about 9 o'clock, they've ingested the study drug. And we then settle in for about the next 5 to 6 hours of really mostly inwardly focused work. And it can look a little bit like this. So this is a mock-up of a couple of therapists. Actually, the gentleman on the right is Bruce Poulter. He's a nurse in Boulder, Colorado. And this was one of the study settings. And so you see here, this looks a little different than a standard therapy session. So the subject here is lying on a couch. They're in a comfortable kind of living room-like environment. They're wearing eye shades to help them direct their attention inward. They've got music pre-selected on those headphones that is helping to direct their attention inward, usually kind of spacious ambient music. And you'll see that that Bruce is holding this person's hand, which would have been something that would have been discussed in the preparation session. If the person was saying, I might get a little scared, or I might need some reassurance, that consent would have been navigated before the person ever takes the drug. And most of the time, the people doing the therapy work are going to be sitting there holding that space. And so if you've ever helped deliver a baby, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you've ever been with somebody in the last moments of their life, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not dissimilar from that. So we're not always doing something. It's more important that we be something, that our presence is more important than what we're doing. And this is where I think nurses are going to be excellent at this, because we know how to do this. Don't just do something, sit there, right? Is the adage sometimes. And that's a lot of times what we're doing, because we're trying to leverage something which we sometimes refer to as an inner healing intelligence. This idea that we know how to heal if we're given the space to do it. A lot of times we can't make a laceration heal any faster than it's going to heal at its own rate, but we can make the conditions optimum for that healing to happen by cleaning out the wound and maybe bringing the edges together. But we can't make the body heal any faster than it can already do so, but we can definitely support that process. So we can think of this as sort of like the intensive caring unit, right? This is where nursing comes in here. This is a kind of midwifery work that we're doing. And so there might not be a lot of talking during these sessions. I think a lot of times people imagine we're sitting there having a back and forth dialogue, like you might think of regular psychotherapy. Not necessarily the case. So we're allowing people to have this sort of inner-directed experience that we then talk about in the days following. So we do non-drug integration therapy, where the same therapist sit down and talk with that subject about what they experienced. And we start to look for opportunities to try and take that experience and operationalize it in day-to-day life. So somebody might have an insight, for example, that like, geez, I've realized as my depression has gone on through my life, I've really kept people at arm's length. I don't let people into my inner world. And I'm realizing that's also contributing to my own loneliness and my own sense of isolation. And I want to do something about that. And so that person we might work with that person and say, well, what would that look like? What would it be like to be a little more open and a little more vulnerable? And could you try that between now and our next integration session? So we're really trying to kind of try this experience, which can often sometimes be quite mystical and quite large, but to really bring that into the day-to-day life. That's what we're trying to accomplish here during the integration period. Where nurses come into this, and where this is so familiar to nurses, is that we all learned from Florence Nightingale. We learned her environmental theory of nursing. What's the famous story about what Florence Nightingale did when she got in the hospital in Crimea? She opened the windows and cleaned the place up, right? Because more people were dying of wounds, of infections, than they were from battlefield wounds. And so changing the environment helped the patients to heal. And we know this in nursing. This is just second nature. And psychedelics folks know this too. This is Timothy Leary, of course, talking about how the psychedelic experience is so different when it's in a setting where this is safe and comfortable and protected versus something that might be a little more unpredictable, more naturalistic use sometimes at, say, a festival or a party. It can be a little more unpredictable because we don't always know what that environment is going to be like. We don't know what sort of emotional aspects are going to come up for that person. And so in this setting, we're doing this in a very intentional, very safe and protected kind of way. And I've been fascinated with how nursing can really inform this for our non-nurse colleagues. When I tell, I'm really interested in the Q&A today because when I talk with this to non-nurse colleagues, this is kind of revelatory. It's sort of like when medicine discovered wellness and holistic care. And I said, we've been doing this for a long time in nursing. I'm glad you discovered it. Happy to teach it to you. But this is not new. You did not discover this. This has been here a long time. And so I wanted to try and begin to articulate what nursing had to bring to the table around this. And I was joined by a couple of fantastic colleagues, Janice Phelps there, who runs the training program that Melanie and I both went through, Billy Rosa, who's in New York at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and Jean Watson, who really needs no introduction in this audience. The four of us came together to take Jean's ideas and combine them with some of these ethos of psychedelic therapy. And I'm calling this psychedelic Caritas nursing as a nod to Jean's fantastic work. But if you've read Jean Watson, and I'll be totally honest with you, Jean Watson went way over my head when I was in nursing school. I was not ready for Jean Watson. I was way too rational, way too kind of materialist worldview, show me how the drug works, right? That's what I was interested in. I didn't understand things like mysticism when I was in nursing school. So when I started looking at Jean's work in 20 years later from nursing school, I started realizing that this interfaced really nicely with psychedelic work. So there's sort of two columns you can think of, and I don't have time to get into them with too much detail, but I give you the 30,000-foot view. One portion is taking care of the patient. The other part is taking care of ourselves and the world at large. And this whole thing is predicated on a relationship, and that relationship being built on trust and seeing the person as a whole person and understanding how they operate, their worldview and how they see themselves. We're showing up as nurses for this patient undergoing this treatment authentically. And because most of it is internal that they're experiencing, we're supporting that inner world of theirs. And we're supporting that with a sense of loving kindness, with equanimity, meaning that we don't get too attached to either negative or positive experiences that they're having, that really all of that is welcome for the patient undergoing this. And that we get to kind of have fun. We get to be a little bit playful with this. If you've ever been a nurse and you had to be a little bit, you have to get creative in order to help a patient through something. You know what I'm talking about. And that's sometimes we're called upon to do that in this work too. And then this idea of tending to our own spiritual practice. You don't have to be religious to do this work, but one has to have a degree of openness to something larger than ourselves, because that often emerges during these sort of psychedelic experiences. Sorry if there's a little background clatter. It's my dog coming in saying good morning to me. And that we have to be aware of ourselves. That's really important. We talk in psychiatric nursing a lot about therapeutic use of self, and that's really important in this work too. And we have to be open to this, again, that larger sense of spirituality, even if it may not be our personal beliefs, that's not important, but being open and receptive to whatever the person is experiencing, because big experiences often come up in these. And again, speaking to that physical environment, we're creating a place that's safe and protected. And this is where nurses really shine in this. It's possible if somebody's having a really big psychedelic experience, they might be incontinent. It happens sometimes. You sort of forget you have a body, and that body needs to pee, and you have an episode of incontinence. Nurses are like, yeah, no big deal. I've cleaned up plenty of people in my life. I tell my therapist friends this, they get really weirded out, right? So this is, but I mean, I'm being a little flippant here, but we forget sometimes that those basic things that we do of taking care of a fellow person's body are what Jean would call sacred. And I absolutely agree with her. And so there's a kind of a sacred aspect to this work. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Andrew, this is all very interesting, but does it actually work? And increasingly, we're getting the answer that is yes. So this was a study that came out from an organization based in the UK, published in a little journal called the New England Journal of Medicine. You might have heard of it. Last year, comparing 3 different doses of psilocybin. A very small dose, might consider that a placebo, a moderate dose, and a high dose, and then looking at drops in a standardized depression rating scale, which is what we're looking at on the left here. So you can see very quickly after this dose was delivered, 2 days after the dosing session, we see these rapid drops in depression scores, and people that got the highest dose tended to drop down low and stay low over the 12 weeks of this study duration. So it does appear to have an effect. I was fortunate enough to work on a second phase 2 trial, which was published in another little journal you probably heard of called JAMA, just last month, where we did a similar study, except ours was 6 weeks long, and we did a comparison against niacin. So niacin thought of as like an active placebo, right? So you get some flushing, you feel a little weird, but you certainly don't have any psychedelic effects, and you certainly don't have any antidepressant effects. And that was exactly what we showed in this study. So again, you see at our first point of measurement after the study, which was our first primary endpoint, which is 8 days out, see this rapid drop in depression scores that persisted for the 6 weeks following the treatment, whereas the niacin group did not show that kind of robust separation. So it does appear to work. You're probably also smartly wondering about side effects. We expect things like transient hypertension during the study. Most of these drugs have a mild pressor effect. We do see some tachycardia. We see some hypertension. Generally nothing that requires intervention, because one of the things that we're doing is screening people for uncontrolled hypertension before they come into the study. It's very common for people to get a headache at the end of the session, absolutely treatable with things like ibuprofen and acetaminophen. Nausea is not uncommon as the drug begins to come on, and sometimes people feel some physical discomfort. They can feel a little restless sometimes. Anxiety is not uncommon, and one could see that as an adverse event, or we could see it as an expected event. And because the point of this experience is not to enhance an experience at a festival or a party, but really to dig down into some difficult psychological material, we expect to see some anxiety, which is manageable through that psychological support that we create during the session. And sometimes, people can get some pretty weird experiences during this that are limited largely to the experience, the time of the drug effects, which is about 4 to 6 hours, and then go away. And so all of that can be really managed during the psychotherapy session in that psychotherapeutic container. We do have rescue meds. We have, clonidine and nitroglycerin for hypertension if we needed it. We have a benzodiazepine if we needed it for anxiety, but we never really need to deploy those things. And we're also very selective about who we let into these studies. So if you have a history of psychosis, for example, we don't let people into the studies. So this is where this has sort of brought us to now, just wrapping up my section here. So, before a drug is ever studied in human populations, it's studied in animals, and then small drug studies are done for safety, phase 1 studies in humans. And then we start to look in phase 2, does this actually do something for the condition for which we hope it will? So phase 2 is what I was working on in psilocybin. And then you have to replicate that twice per the FDA to show that it is better than a placebo in phase 3. And so and then if you do all that and the FDA agrees with you, you can get FDA approval for your drug. So this is where we're at for MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD, which I haven't really talked too much about, but maybe we can touch on in Q&A, is probably going to be the first thing out of the gate. Probably as early as middle of next year. And then psilocybin is a little further back. So phase 2 is finished, phase 3 has begun. And I'd say that's probably, if those are successful, 4 to 5 years out at this point. But you might think, but I'm hearing about psychedelics in Oregon. I'm hearing about psilocybin in Oregon. And that's a perfect transition here to these other models in which this is being delivered. So I've talked really exclusively about what's in the top left corner, which is the medicalization perspective and the medicalization route. But there are a lot of other ways in which people have been ingesting psychedelics for a long time and continue to do so. And what's happening in Oregon is a really interesting model. And so this is a great sort of pivot to my colleague, Melanie Velez here, who's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's see if I could find the spot that advances my slides. So I'm Melanie Velez. I'm a psych nurse practitioner. And before that, I was a hospital nurse on pediatrics and in the float pool, including the psychiatric unit. And I live in Eugene, Oregon. If you haven't been here, we'd love for you to visit. It is kind of a home of the hippies, a liberal place to be. A lot of people think of Oregon as one of the first state who had physician-assisted dying. The overground practice of being a death doula. One of the very early places where cannabis became legalized. The home of Eugene is the home of the Oregon Country Fair. And the Merry Pranksters, and Ken Kesey was a big part of that. If you've ever read the book or seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which talks about mental health struggles. He's from our town. And so there's a tremendous amount of underground understanding and underground lineage that comes in where you see the green zones, a western Willamette Valley area, and down south closer to Ashland. Of support of these medicines, use of these medicines for a long, long time, since before they were decriminalized or before they were criminalized, and that may or may not have stopped, right, when they became illegal, and they are still federally illegal. So what we are doing is not federally legal. It is state legalized by the voters, and not in every county. As you can see, it was actually pretty contentious. You can kind of see where the more liberal parts are and where the openness to having access to a psilocybin experience, not a medical treatment, can't be recommended. Me as a psych nurse practitioner, this is not something I can recommend. This is not something I can call therapy. Got to be really careful about that. But nevertheless, it passed, as well as the decriminalization of all substances in small quantities. A lot of that was aimed at looking at the incarcerated population of Oregon, primarily Black and Brown identifying people who were in there for possession, cannabis offenses, things like that, and really recognizing how targeting that was, and the stigma that's there, and how we may be able to treat addictions better if we can try a different model. Okay, so I'm trying to advance the slide. I think I need a little help just pushing the slide forward if someone wants to. So if you want more information, here is the legal website to go to where you can find service centers to have an experience yourself coming from out of state. Anyone can come to Oregon and have an experience. You can find facilitators up there. Next slide. Oh, I see what I'm doing. Here we go. So thank you. So right now in Oregon, there are 4 legal psychedelic experiences you can have. The top left is psilocybin mushrooms. The middle one is ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So on the left, this would be the non-medicalized, just experience-based, whereas ketamine is more the therapy medicalized approach that you saw Andrew talking about. On the right, those are the Santo Daime churches. 3 of them have full federally legal status to give ayahuasca experience in a religious context with a religious exemption. And then on the bottom is breath work, things like Stan Grof's holotropic breath work. Those are, of course, legal and with you always, having an altered and expanded state of consciousness with breath work. Oregon has a number of service centers popping up. I try to kind of place them on this slide as they are in the state. So Epic Healing in Eugene is the one closest to me. Journey up in Portland is newer and doing a beautiful kind of BIPOC focused access where I think they have, at least 10 journeys a month that are significantly discounted. And these journeys range anywhere from $0, which is bendable therapy, is donation-based. It is a charity. And again, I just want to put a disclaimer out there. Andrew and I aren't recommending any of these. These can't be medical treatments. These are just experiences and opportunities that are offered within the state of Oregon that I know about. Right. So this one is, it's called therapy. That's controversial. There's a lot of gray area when you're doing something that is federally illegal, but state legalized. And again, state legalized means that it happens with licensed psilocybin facilitators who are trained at licensed training centers like Subtle Winds, where I work, and I train facilitators how to do what they do. And they happen in legal service centers that go through a whole rigorous process of how they can be legal, how they must monitor and safeguard the medicine, how they educate clients and help select those things. There's Satya and Omnia down in Ashland. Hood River has Vital Reset, and then there's one in Albany, and more are popping up seems like every month. Here you can see a picture of what the actual product looks like. Satori Farms is a woman-owned psilocybin farm. They were a farm of non-psilocybin long before that. You can have whole product mushroom or what we call homogenized, where it's ground. And you get to prepare it yourself. We can help you take the medicine, but facilitators do not touch the medicine. So I know of myself and another nurse working in this space, and we are not allowed to touch the medicine, right? So there's also a boundary that is the scope of practice. And the law of Oregon says that you must abandon your nursing scope of practice and use only your psilocybin facilitator scope of practice when you are working in a psilocybin service center. Here are some examples of doses, and what you'll see is psilocybin analyte is the dosing here. The max dose is 50 milligrams. And, we're learning here in the Wild Wild West as we go. Andrew works in research with synthetic product. So it's consistent every single time. And here in Oregon, it is grown in Oregon. It is organic product like you just saw on the previous slide. And what that means is we can't be totally sure of exactly what the dose is of this mushroom versus this mushroom. So we kind of have to do our best educated guessing. And we used to think that, 30 milligrams was about 3 dried grams. And I think what we're finding now amongst different strains and psilocin content is that maybe, 30 milligrams is more like 5 dried grams, and 50 milligrams is more like 7 or 8, depending on the strain of dried grams, if you're familiar with those, much perhaps stronger than we thought they would be. Here is an actual breakdown from some of the species of what's offered in Oregon. So Pumpkin Hillbilly, for example, would be a much stronger strain having a higher psilocin content. And so a facilitator might say, you know, this is probably going to feel a lot stronger, a lot more dissociation. So what's interesting to me as a nurse is that all these different models of care are coming forward. Moksha Journey down in Ashland is a residential substance use treatment, and they do other things, but substance use treatment branch called Transcendence. So it's 28 days of residential addiction recovery where you live with the people that you're going through recovery with and having those experiences, but they have the option of going to a legal psilocybin service center and having legal psilocybin journeys as part of the recovery program, as part of the insight. And I think that's an interesting application. I view psychedelics as medicine, and the medicine that they offer is perspective changing, and they're connectors to self, connectors to others, connectors to nature, connectors to the hard parts, connectors to the grief, connectors to fear. And that's why some people say, oh, there's bad trips or difficult trips. And it's really, you know, what is this medicine allowing you to connect to? How is the perspective shift going to happen? Right. And that's not predictable. And some people don't like that, but it can be very powerful. It's not for everybody. And because it's not for everybody, we know that a history of psychosis, a history of pretty brutal mania, being on lithium can increase the risk for seizure with psilocybin. Suicidal ideation, sometimes, you know, because these medicines work in an unpredictable way, you might get better before you get worse, and worse before you get better. Suicidal ideation might get worse, might get better. It's not totally predictable. And so active suicidal ideation and self-harm would be another reason to not have these medicines. And this open nexus, right, is meant to collect data and be a reporting hub for adverse events. As a nurse in this space, what I'm finding is that I'm actually getting more potential reports of adverse events than perhaps the nexus is. And my job as a nurse focused on public health and safety and risk and harm reduction is to connect with the nexus so that we are all learning these lessons of, you know, perhaps a client is having psychosis afterward, and it was a really challenging trip, and instead of showing up for their integration, they get paranoid and they leave, right? So the service center may not actually know what the harms are and what's happening, and it's up to community and public health and community connections to help hold that safety net. So that's what we're doing, and nurses are so incredibly pivotal and important in that. We're the ones at the front line in the emergency room talking to these clients first, often talking about their experiences and then connecting back to the nexus. So we legalized in January 1st of this year. It was challenging for many reasons. Like I talked about, really understanding what is this raw organic mushroom doing? How strong is it? How do we dose it? Why is it so variable? There's a lot of things that go into a mushroom that aren't just psilocybin and psilocybin that may add to the effects that we don't fully understand in the science. We are definitely running ahead of the research here in Oregon, for better or worse. Facilitators had to get trained. There may not be enough training or enough affordable training for marginalized communities wanting to do this work. So Subtle Winds, where I work, ALMA, CIS, many of these programs, training programs that we'll talk about later, do offer scholarship or discount for marginalized community, but it's still lagging. The Oregon Health Authority changed the payment system. There's a tax on this medicine. It was kind of complicated to figure out how to do all of the rules. There are just so many rules, and it is expensive to start a service center. And it's expensive for me to be a psilocybin facilitator. It's $2,000 each year for my license. And then my attorney said, oh, you should pay $3,000 to me to give you forms that say, in addition to all of the legal Oregon forms, we want your client to sign this form saying that when they're in an altered state of consciousness under this mushroom, they promise to remember that you're not their therapist or psychiatric prescriber and absolve you of some liability. There's a lot of scrutiny about what's happening in the space. This is just one forensic psychiatric person who's writing an article saying how horrible it is that Oregon is offering these experiences. And they have some valid points. You know, the research isn't fully behind this. But again, this isn't a medical treatment. This is an opt-in experience for adults. So as a nurse, I face a lot of dilemmas, that the keeping clear scope of practice is a real challenge. I do worry about what my state board is going to say, and to be proactive, a lot of us nurses are getting together and approaching the Oregon State Board of Nursing to set cultural norms, to say, hey, how about we have a discussion about this? And I hope one day to have a discussion with them, and I already am having a discussion with my community about, what if I have a patient? For example, I work with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, ketamine being another full psychedelic. I used to not believe that it was, and I now, working with it, believe that it is. And I work with people with pedophilic disorder, and working with perspective-changing medicines like ketamine, like psychedelics, can be so beneficial and so helpful. And so I want to make sure that I'm thinking really carefully about, is it okay for me, for some select clients, to be their psilocybin facilitator, or do I keep an absolute boundary? If you are my psychiatric client, you can never be my facilitated client, right? So these are all careful discussions to have. And I would say the best advice I ever got was to move at the speed of trust with the client, with the state, with myself and my own intuition. It's hard to understand signaling from the DEA or the federal government sometimes about what is the right thing to do. We are in gray area, and I must get comfortable with ambiguity and do the best I can. That's all I can do. So how nurses are making an impact: we're working in ethical spaces, we're working in risk reduction. If you've ever seen the Fireside Project, you can call them up, you can text them, you can have free integration. If you're having a difficult time on a journey in the underground, which a lot of people in my state do, we have decriminalization here. So people feel now more free to access resources. It doesn't mean that people weren't using substances and psychedelics long before this, but now, it's a lot easier to talk about reducing risk and harm. As a psych nurse practitioner, since decriminalization has happened, I would say almost a third of my clients have come forward and said, hey, I should probably tell you that I've been microdosing for the last 2 years. And I am worried about my risk of this, and I want to talk about some of the risks and what I'm really facing. Yeah. See here, I'm going to speed up just a little bit because we're getting short on time. So how am I making a difference? I sit in circle with other BIPOC facilitators. I give consultation. I do apprenticeships for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for therapists who want to learn that. I'm gonna go up to this slide right here. I never work alone. It's always in community. I'm starting a website, Psychedelic Grassroots, so we can talk about what are the resources that clients have, because what we're getting is a lot of clients from out of state wanting to have this journey and maybe not having a sufficient support container at home or personal skill set or things that they need to do that. I'm working on creating a community safety net with Dr. Michael Howdy and some ER physicians and some cardiologists here. So primary care physicians, nurse practitioners, nurses can come to us and get a curbside consult and say, hey, this client has supraventricular tachycardia, for example. What kind of risk should we be thinking about? What needs to happen? And then we're also working with the Reconsider organization in New York, trying to start thinking about new ways to have nurses healing nurses for post-COVID wellness, that thing that Andrew talked about, the betterment of well people, and also the addressing of some of the harms that have happened to us as nurses in COVID. I feel like I kind of had a blessing making it through COVID because of all these things I've learned as a psych nurse practitioner, these tools, a different way of seeing the world, and I would love to be able to share that in a legal way with other nurses. I think one of the blessings and beauty of being a nurse is setting cultural norms. It's up to us. And I encourage you to go to the website that was up there, the VPS-psychiatry, and you can go to the about and look at my ethical practices and processes statement. I believe in radical transparency. I want us to be able to take these skills and this knowledge and this deep felt embodied wisdom that you can get from psychedelics sometimes, back to our units, back to the culture where we are, so that we can connect back to each other, and we can do it in an ethical way that really addresses nursing core ethical values. Okay, so a couple more slides left to go. I want to make sure that we understand our role. Andrew did a beautiful job in his research study of saying, here's all the ways that nurses really add to psychedelic space. But I'd also say we're connectors. We are the code switchers. We can speak to legislators. We can speak to families. We can speak to medical professionals. We can speak in the research. And we're also educating in a really balanced way. This medicine is not for everybody. And I get a lot of people who call me up and they said, oh my gosh, I read Michael Pollan's book and I just know that everyone in my family needs to have this. And in the underground, we kind of call them the pollinators, right? And nurses can be the most trusted profession in our nation and come with a calm, balanced, fair, non-stigmatized voice, learning about these medicines, saying, here's something to consider. They aren't for everybody, but here are some things to think about in terms of safety, in terms of moving at the speed of trust, and doing that as a norm. Here's some resources for harm and risk reduction that you can take back with you. You can Google Fireside Project. Your clients may come to you and say, hey, I looked online, because you can right now. You can go online and look up Eugene Psilocybin Church or Oregon ayahuasca trip, right? And you will find all these people offering all of these things, saying they're shaman and facilitators and all of this stuff. And how do you choose a good, how do you reduce your harm? They're going to do it anyway. How do you reduce harm? Right? I really want to put some plugs in for people who feel like they need to participate in the research, referring clients to research if you think that would be appropriate or not. There are ways to find an interactive map right here, how to find psychedelic trials, including some maybe that Andrew is doing. Epic Psychedelic, this is an international ethical community where you can connect to community. It's a signal thread. It is a website. They offer a lot of kind of free ethical consultations by donation. And they really want to support reducing harm in the space. And then I would just say the most important thing I think nurses can do is, we're trained to do biopsychosocial spiritual needs of the client. And when a client discloses they've had an altered state of consciousness experience, whether that's from a psychedelic or a birth or a death process or something else that's happening, or a ketamine journey, and they're coming out of the PACU, waking from surgery, because you can be in this psychedelic states with ketamine, to point them to resources like integration groups, support, appropriate nutrition, hydration, and just listening without stigma. Here's some more resources. There's Epic. Idelic is in my town. This is an actual physical library inside the Trauma Healing Project. And it's a beautiful space to come and connect with community. I think New York has a psychedelic library also to connect with. And there's lots of places to go learn more free trainings, more paid trainings. This is how I hope we can all make an impact, checking our own stigma and our own microaggressions with psychedelics and clients talking about psychedelics, developing a deeper understanding of the benefits and the pitfalls that can happen, connecting with your local legal entities. That could be ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, right? But that could also be things like the Asian Psychedelic Collective, your own affinity groups. There are Jewish, there are Christian psychedelic groups. There are all of these different BIPOC, LGBTQIA, military veterans. There are all of these groups that are all working together. Even, entities and working on the front lines, right? Y'all are going to be seeing the impacts of psychedelics, potentially of ketamine and suicidal ideation. Even OHSU here in Portland, Oregon offers ketamine treatment for suicidal teens, right? Trying to keep them out of our 2 youth facilities, inpatient youth facilities. Right, learning about the indications, really understanding what legal retreats and legal trainings are. Don't be afraid to ask for discounts. Andrew was teasing me yesterday, never pay retail. I love that. Because we so need to be in this space. And we aren't making as much money as physicians, and doing this work can be costly to us personally before it becomes fully legalized federally. Remembering that this is old indigenous medicine and old indigenous wisdom, and we probably shouldn't be calling ourselves shaman if that is not our true lineage and training. But it doesn't mean that we can't honor that wisdom and training, and we should honor what's come before us. We talked already about connecting to resources to reduce risk. And also then just holding good boundaries, holding good personal boundaries, being comfortable, getting comfortable with ambiguity, being willing to check our own shadow and our own issues in this space and in community with each other. That facilitates healing. And then listening without what I call inflicting assistance. Sometimes we get so excited about the potential and hope in psychedelic medicines, but there can also be a lot of pressure and toxicity that comes with hope as a medicine. And we have to be really careful that we're not inflicting our help with our own interpretations, but rather letting the client have their own experience. This is a very person-centered, inner healing intelligence guided process that happens in psychedelic healing. And it's not for us to make sense of it for them. There's the open nurses about us. I guess it was in here. This is a list of training programs. Andrew mentioned he and I went to CIS CPTR training program. That's wonderful. It's research focused, but there are many others. The chat is popping up for me. There's EPIC again. MAPS is the one doing MDMA. Reconsider is working just on a very basic level, not necessarily promoting any one medicine, but just expanding consciousness and helping healers and veterans and people who want to just understand more. But you as nurses can go and look at the nurses Reconsider. And then here's just some of the training programs. This one is more for medical. This one is BIPOC focused, and they're expanding from Oregon, not just psilocybin, but many other substances. I mean, you name a focus in Europa, I think is maybe mindfulness or Buddhist focused. You name a type of program, it's out there. And really you need to ask yourself, if you're considering doing this work or considering doing the training, what is my approach? What resonates with me? Rather than just picking a program willy-nilly, do some homework. There's so many programs out there. And let's see. The last thing I want to say is, I don't work outside of community. I think it's a red flag for people who work outside of community, and I want to invite you into my community, and I need you in this work. I cannot be the only, warrior, ethical voice, open to hearing all of the goods and bads so that we can connect people to resources and help that are out there. So yeah, let's do some questions.
Wow, this has been really wonderful. I thank you both for sharing all of this great information. The chat has been very active throughout, as well as the Q&A, and I know that Andrew has been answering some questions along the way, so I appreciate that. Just a few things while we're waiting for some more questions to come in. This webinar is being recorded, and you will get access to the recording along with the PDF of the slides. So you will be able to reference all of these great resources that have been provided. So in about 1 week, you will receive via email the link to the presentation recording and the PDF of the slides. So jumping right into some of these questions, I think, Melanie, this probably speaks to some of the content you were covering. Are there any indigenous Shama presence direct input noted throughout the research?
I think it has been maybe slower to come. Andrew can back me up. There was a really beautiful article, a research article that interviewed shaman and talked about their wisdom and what they hope and how they would like to be honored. And so there is actually an ethical code that's being developed for how we include indigenous wisdom and practice there. And there are lots of researchers, Bia Labati, Loizaga, people who are coming from ayahuasca traditions. And honestly, a lot of the programs here in Oregon are connecting with those indigenous healers. Subtle Winds, for example, brings a curandero from the Oaxaca area, a Zapotec man, to come in and do ceremony. I know Alma Institute training program has Claudia Cuentas, who's a Peruvian healer and sound healer. Really beautiful connections. A lot of people, I think Intertrek takes people down. Lots of programs are going back and forth down to the lower Americas. So does that help answer the question?
Yes, I think so. Andrew, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Melanie covered that really nicely.
Perfect.
I'll try and put
Um,
that art.
yeah, that would be wonderful. What about peyote? Have you been using that? Have you been seeing that? What does that look like in this space and place? Excuse me.
So I have a personal ethical commitment to never use peyote myself, because that is not my lineage, that is not my practice, and the environmental damage and change that's happening there is really hurting the ability for peyote to grow in its natural landscape. There are synthetic derivatives that in the research I know are available. It's not something that I personally feel called to currently, but I want to just put that out there that, peyote has been used for thousands of years by Native Americans and people in the Mexico area, and I want to do what I can to preserve that for them. What about you, Andrew?
Yeah, so peyote, for people who are not familiar, is a very slow-growing cactus that grows in the Sonoran Desert, or sorry, and I guess that would be the Sonoran Desert in the southern Mexico, northern Mexico, southern Texas, and it's endangered status and its use by the Native American church and affiliated groups really has really made it appropriately off limits for most for any kind of psychedelic research. And it contains mescaline, for people that are not familiar with mescaline alkaloids, which can be lab synthesized. They also are more readily available in San Pedro or Wachuma cactus. And so there are some clinical trials looking at mescaline. There is a study looking at mescaline for alcohol use disorder, which is something which I didn't get a chance to talk too much about, is the use of these compounds in substance use treatment, which may seem kind of counterintuitive to some people because of the way that we got trained that all substances are kind of interchangeable and equally problematic. But the interesting thing about psychedelics is they tend to be non-reinforcing, so they're actually quite different than, say, something such as alcohol or cocaine. So there is research into that, but with most all of these clinical trials, it's important to underscore that we are using lab synthesized versions of these compounds, and that is in part because the FDA requires things to be made under what are called good manufacturing practices, which, so a lot of times people think we're grinding up mushrooms and putting them in capsules, and that's not the case. This is lab synthesized psilocybin that we're using. But yeah, circling back to the original question, we really want to be thoughtful about honoring the traditions that have been holding these medicines for a lot longer than the last 70 years, which is when sort of Western medicine stumbled across them. It looks like Melanie's adding some more resources to the chat here, and I was trying to do so as she was speaking. Do we have more questions that we want to cover?
We do have a few more questions. So I want to kind of pivot, and we have some questions in regards to students. So are there opportunities for students to be involved with this work, or is it only limited to licensed graduates?
So a couple of things to think about. So depending on where you're going to school, there may be research going on at different health sciences campuses around the world. Easiest way to find clinical trials, either because you're interested in for it yourself or for referring a patient, or because you want to see kind of where the research action is, I would say is clinicaltrials.gov. That's National Institutes of Health website, pretty easy to navigate. You can do a search for psilocybin or MDMA and see where those studies are happening. And if you're wanting to refer patients, you can see what their enrollment criteria are. So that's a really useful resource. There isn't sort of one centralized place where you can say, I'm a student, I'm interested in this. I think this is where sort of fortune favors the bold. If you are at one of these places and you approach the primary investigator of that lab. There might be opportunities there to help out. A place where people can get trained to volunteer to sit with people who are having challenging psychedelic experiences would be the Fireside Project, which Melanie mentioned. This is a volunteer-run text and telephone service for people who are having a challenging psychedelic experience or want to talk about a psychedelic experience or are preparing to have a psychedelic experience. So it operates from a place of harm reduction. And this is a service that takes and trains volunteers to answer that phone line. So that is definitely a place where I think students who are really inspired by this could get some experience in sitting with people in non-ordinary states of consciousness.
I want to jump in too and say, just so you all know, in Oregon, the only requirement is that you're a high school graduate, and I think age 21 without a felony, to get be eligible for training for sitting with someone in psilocybin medicine space, well, non-medicine space. And it is, most programs do have a more serious look at who you are, but there are plenty of people who don't even have a nursing degree. So just having, being a nursing student, I think is really important and could be a really beautiful offering. And there are many programs out there that do not require you to be a medical professional at all, right? CISCPTR even allows clergy, right? There are many programs that are just people in the space, right? Non-trained.
Yeah. There's some really good comments coming up in here that I just want to highlight. Katiana pointed out that essentially talking about how there is a wide range of people who will be sort of seeking this sort of experience or treatment, if it's in a therapeutic context, or experience if it's in a kind of organ type experience kind of context, and they're not all the same. And I think that's going to be, just as we as nurses are always assessing patients, I think we need to be thinking about how do we match the level of complexity, clinical complexity, to the skill level of the therapist. So for example, like, I have not been in an ICU in 20 years. If you stuck me in an ICU with a patient who had multi-organ failure and was on a vent and on ECMO, I'd probably kill that person accidentally, right? So I am not the person skilled for that job. And similarly, there may be people seeking psychedelic experiences who are psychologically relatively healthy, relatively uncomplicated, and that may be a great match for somebody who does not have as deep of a psychotherapy kind of training. And on the other side of the spectrum, there are going to be people who are very psychologically complicated, maybe with complex trauma, personality structures that can be challenging and such, and that person might need to be matched with somebody who is very skilled in that area. And so it's I think one of the things we're going to have to put some real thought into as we translate this research into actual practice is, how do we match the skill level with the person seeking the treatment? That's going to be very important in order to keep this safe.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing, both of you. Melanie, did you have something to say in addition to that?
Oh, yeah. So ketamine is a full psychedelic. That is legal. Ketamine clinics are happening across America, some across the world. Ketamine is the #1 drug of abuse in Asia. And a lot of that's getting shut down, and it's causing a lot of supply problems as well. But I'll say, even for highly trained providers, I know someone who is a physician who does ketamine work in a clinic, owns a clinic, and the clients come in, they get hooked up to an IV, but they put on headphones and they turn on Fox News and leave. And then the client comes to me later and says, that was the worst thing ever. I just re-experienced, my sexual trauma, and there was nothing there for me. So even in a medicalized setting, there aren't perfect things. And that's why nurses are so important, to look at a person holistically and work on these programs. We need you.
I love that. I love, bringing it back to the whole person and what that looks like. And so I appreciate you bringing that back to the surface, Melanie. We have a couple questions. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but for foreign nurses, we have somebody joining us from Chile. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Do you know, would they have to validate their degree in order to do training in the US? I don't know the answer to that. Do either of you?
It depends on the type of training you want. So legal Oregon psilocybin facilitation, like I said, just any high school diploma, you don't have to necessarily validate your degree to do that. Andrew, what's the program with, I think it's Columbia School of Social Work and UPenn School of Nurse Practitioner? I think you do have to validate your degree for that one.
Well, so yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So UPenn School of Nursing and the Columbia School of Social Work are in the process of developing curriculum for their respective students around psychedelic therapies, and so that's a work in progress right now. But that's definitely that will be a future training program. So most of the training programs that perhaps our colleague was referring to, there isn't at this point, we're still sort of early days in those programs. They are not by any means sort of uniform or yet accredited, so that's something to keep in mind, is that most of the people on this call probably went through an accredited RN program and perhaps an accredited advanced practice training program, and that led you to be able to be eligible to sit for an exam like the NCLEX or the ANCC exams if you're a nurse practitioner, which then allows you to hold out in that role and to obtain a license in that role. It's important to understand that we are not yet in that stage of evolution. Sorry, I only had one cup of coffee this morning. Evolution in psychedelic space. I think we will in the years to come. There is a nascent board of psychedelic medicine and therapies that I've been part of, full disclosure, that is working to create a accreditation exam, which I am hell-bent and determined to make sure that nurses can take that exam as well, so that nurses can be accredited to do this work. But it's important to understand that if you do want to do any of these training programs, then there's no guarantee that at the end of that you're going to meet whatever minimum requirements, which are yet to be determined for a psychedelic facilitator. Oregon is a bit of an exception, because they're kind of creating their own rules around this framework here. There may be other exceptions. Colorado has also created sort of some similar structures to Oregon, but that has their own set of laws. And so in the United States, nursing is regulated state by state. I know in my program, the one that Melanie and I went through at California Institute for Integral Studies, we had some international colleagues. I had a physician from Spain. Most of these programs don't have any kind of practica, which is honestly one of the shortcomings of them. So it's a little bit, I will sometimes explain this to people. It's like, imagine if you went through nursing school and the first time you actually met a patient was after you got your RN. It would be kind of strange, right? And so some of these programs do use simulation models, or they'll use a non-drug induced non-ordinary state of consciousness like holotropic breath work in order to give people some sense of experience with this work. Some programs use ketamine as a means of providing that. But for the most part, you're not getting the sort of practica experience that you would in the training that maybe you've already gone through. However, as such, that does make it more accessible to people who, like the person asking from another country who's not licensed in the US.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have just a few minutes left, so I want to open it back up to both you, Melanie, and you, Andrew, if you have any final parting words or any last little nuggets you would like to share with our participants before I close us out today.
Melanie, do you want to take that first? Or I think you're in the middle of answering a question here on the chat.
Yeah, I was trying to respond to Sandy Sandberg about affordability. And what I would say is there are a group of us who are committed to offering affordable psilocybin journey for marginalized communities. I know Johanny Askins is one of them. I'm focused on doing that. There's a whole circle of us, and as well for the LGBTQI community. So reach out to service centers and see who they know. Hopefully the Oregon Health Authority will update the list of people who are having their like emails and phone numbers published. They kind of just published the first 50 people who became licensed in Oregon, and almost all of them were kind of Caucasian identifying, right? And so yeah, feel free to email me if you want. My email is right there. I'm happy to connect you with some of the people that I know who are trying to really offer affordable, accessible work.
I mean, in terms of final thoughts, one thing I would really just say is that psychedelic therapy needs nurses. They need all the things that we bring. Sometimes, I think nurses struggle from sort of afterthought syndrome, which is where, there's a historic thread of struggles around power in nursing, and there's sort of a subtext of, well, don't forget about us, and really what I want to say is that psychedelics absolutely needs nursing. They need Our non-nursing colleagues need to learn from us. They need to learn how to sit with patients and not necessarily do something. They need to learn that presence is a kind of medicine. And these are things that I think nurses do exceptionally well. And I also want to throw in here too that we need nurses to be skeptical in a thoughtful way, not reflexively skeptical. Don't parrot the things that you were told in your substance use class, which may or may not actually be based in evidence, but to really be thoughtful in your skepticism, but to bring that skepticism. There is, in my opinion, far too much sort of blue sky thinking in the psychedelic space right now, and there's an unwillingness to talk about things that are challenging in a thoughtful way. And I think nurses, because we're always focused on protecting patients, can bring those questions to the conversation in a way that is thoughtful and furthers the conversation. So I want to encourage nurses to be involved in this in many different levels. Absolutely bring our native intelligence of presence and care to the work, but also to bring that patient-focused, patient-protecting view in a thoughtful, not reflexive kind of way. So if this is new for you, there's so much to learn. If you've been doing this for a while, there's still so much to learn. And we've got a lot of work to do. So I look forward to doing it together with all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for all of this great information and for actively engaging with our participants. This has been so wonderful, and we are grateful that you took the time to share with our audience. And we definitely look forward to hearing from both of you in the future and seeing what you do in this space and place. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. As a reminder, about 1 week from today, you'll be emailed a link with instructions on how to obtain your nursing continuing professional development certificate. Be sure to check out Sigma's other upcoming webinars and other resources to support you and your colleagues at sigmanursing.org. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.